It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160, and our conversation with Mark Updegrove, who is the author of a book called Incomparable Grace, JFK in the Presidency, John F. Kennedy in the Presidency, is brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. He is an ABC correspondent, the presidential historian for ABC News. He's also heavily involved with the Lyndon Baines Johnson effort in Texas, and he joins us this morning to talk about this book. And Mark, I have to tell you, it's an amazing book because it actually takes us inside the White House and inside the very, very difficult conversations that JFK had in order to basically grow into the role of the presidency. And that's what he did, didn't he?
Well, yeah, and there's this, I've always written books based on the notion that you write the book you want to read. And there are many books that are very good on John F. Kennedy, but I have not read a book like this. I really wanted the reader to feel the ups and downs and triumphs and tragedy and ultimately the consequence of the Kennedy presidency and how fascinating John F. Kennedy was and enigmatic at the same time. But to your point, you see him grow in the role of president. It doesn't look good for him in the beginning. He gets off to a very shaky start, but he commits himself to the role. He learns and he grows and he ultimately succeeds before being struck down in his prime in November of 1963.
I think one of the interesting aspects of the book is there's a point where he's talking about sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom, which he did at the beginning of the presidency, and he says, I just jumped in and hung on. And that's basically what he did early in his presidency, isn't it?
That's exactly right. So to the first night of living in the White House, he comes back from this late inaugural gala, and he goes up to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. The presidential bedroom is being renovated at that time, so he sleeps in the Lincoln bed, and that's got to weigh heavily on any president. That's the daunting standard of Abraham Lincoln. He said, I just jumped in and hung on, as you said, and that's exactly what he does in his presidency. He goes through some very difficult times in the beginning of his presidency. The Soviet Union unexpectedly leaps ahead of us in the space race, which becomes incredibly important in the Cold War. But more importantly, he stubs his toe in the Bay of Pigs quagmire. The failed incursion of Cuba and the overthrow of Fidel Castro, which fails spectacularly in the eyes of the world. And at that moment, Nikita Khrushchev, who is the Soviet counterpart to John F. Kennedy, feels emboldened and realizes that John F. Kennedy can be exploited, which ultimately leads to the most perilous moment in Kennedy's presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, it might be a little bit stretching it to say that JFK had always survived with his charm, and he found out with Khrushchev that sometimes you got to get in there and take your swings and get your nose bloodied a little bit. But he had such a charming personality, and it did enable him to make a few pretty slick escapes from difficult times. But he did indeed have to learn to toughen up, and he had a great team around him to do that, including his brother Bobby.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think when he goes to a summit, John F. Kennedy does in June of 1961. So he's just a few months into his presidency, and Khrushchev does not have a very flattering view of John F. Kennedy, and that view is even diminished by the experience that Khrushchev has with Kennedy in Vienna during two grueling days of meetings between him and Kennedy. He comes out thinking that Kennedy is too intelligent and too weak. And by too intelligent, I think what he means is he sees Kennedy as this effete intellectual Ivy Leaguer who's not street smart. And Kennedy confesses to being savaged by Khrushchev in these meetings. Those are his words. He said, I was savaged by Khrushchev. And again, it emboldens Khrushchev. He comes from those meetings believing that John F. Kennedy can be exploited. And that's when Khrushchev ships missiles to Cuba, which is just 90 miles from American shores. So we have Soviet nuclear missiles in the Western Hemisphere, which becomes untenable for the United States.
You know, one of the interesting things about the book is Bobby Kennedy had such a role as a sort of a pugnacious sort of junior Khrushchev in a way, in the way that he approached things. But Jackie Kennedy, her grace and charm also enabled a little bit of space for John F. Kennedy to grow into the role. Would I be, again, oversimplifying things to put it that way?
No, it's interesting because John F. Kennedy calls himself the antithesis of a politician. His maternal grandfather was Honey Fitz, was his nickname, was the mayor, the very colorful mayor of Boston, and he was the kind of baby kissing, back slapping, name knowing politician that is sort of stereotypical. But Kennedy is not that person. He's very cerebral. He's very intellectual. He's very cool. And Jacqueline Kennedy is too. She's not the typical politician's wife. She doesn't aim to contrive the personality to make her relatable. But when the two become president and first ladies, I think we look upon them very differently. Remember, it's the television age. Television is the prevalent medium at the time, and the two show up so beautifully on television. But ultimately, I think the Kennedys are the way we want to see ourselves as a nation at that time and probably still today. They're young, they're attractive, they're elegant, they're ambitious, they're eloquent. That's exactly how we wanted to see ourselves, particularly, as I mentioned, at a time when we were battling with the Soviet Union for hearts and minds across the world.
John F. Kennedy, of course, had some tremendous things to overcome, not the least of which, of course, his own character flaws, some of which would have basically cut him down had he tried to live the way that he did in today's world as he did back then. And yet John F. Kennedy is somebody who did grow into the role of president, and there have to have been turning points in that presidency and in his life, the way that he approached things that enabled that to happen. What were some of the things that enabled him to grow?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, he is thoughtful. He is cerebral. He is desperately trying to do his best. And he doesn't just want to be president. He wants to be a great president. He wants to be, he sees himself on the world stage with people like Khrushchev and de Gaulle, and he wants to measure up to that. But he comes into the presidency pretty callow and relatively impetuous. And the Bay of Pigs is one example of that. But he resolves to do better. In fact, when the Bay of Pigs happens, he goes in front of a press conference and he says, a good idea has many fathers, but a bad idea is an orphan. But at the end of the day, I'm the commander-in-chief, and the buck stops with me. He takes responsibility for that, and he resolves to do better. He's really candid with the American people. But what's astounding is that his approval rating at that moment, after the Bay of Pigs, this huge disaster on the world stage, his approval rating is 83%. Americans rally around their presidency at that moment. Only 5% of Americans disapproved of the performance of John F. Kennedy, and that's because we have faith in him at that moment. And I think he doesn't take that for granted. He really tries to do his very best. When he meets with Eisenhower in a transition meeting, and Eisenhower is going through the trouble spots in the world, JFK leaves that meeting and says, I can't believe he can stare into the face of disaster with such equanimity. But it's equanimity that saves John F. Kennedy in the most desperate hour of his presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis. He remains calm. He remains cool and collected. He's courageous. He doesn't yield to the military, which is insisting that they need to engage militarily. He decides that he tries desperately to find a peaceful way out of this, and ultimately he does by remaining cool and calm and having grace under pressure.
Just a moment left with Mark Updegrove. He is the author of Incomparable Grace, JFK and the Presidency. When you decided to write this book, I'm sure that, as you said, you write the book that you want to write. Did you find the things that you wanted to find in order to write it?
Yeah, I did. And, I spent a lot of time looking through the oral histories of the Kennedy Library and looking through some of the documents there. I did some original interviews, too, with some of the few who are left, including Andrew Young, of course. Andrew Young being a lieutenant to Martin Luther King during the course of the Civil Rights Movement. Incredibly important perspective on John F. Kennedy, and and his contributions to civil rights. But yeah, I think you can't do a book like this without ensuring that you have all the facts in order to construct your narrative.
And you've done it beautifully. Mark Updegrove, thanks so much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Have a great day.